Thank you all. I'll start by thanking the PSA for this opportunity to speak. I'll be speaking quite broadly about the Canadian offshore oil and gas industry, particularly about the Arctic. And jurisdiction in Canada is always very complicated. I don't have a long legal disclaimer as Tor did, but I will say that I may mention other agencies. Apparently we need, does that work? Okay. So I may refer to other agencies besides the National Energy Board, and I just want to be sure that my marks should not be taken as the position of the Government of Canada or any other federal, provincial, territorial agency. And, and any omissions in this presentation are mine alone. So this is the third time you get to see this same map. I didn't know. In Canada, for those of you who don't know, we actually have 3 offshore oil and gas regulators looking after safety and environmental protection in different geographic regions. I'd be happy to take a break and talk to you about the legal and political ramifications of this, but essentially the Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board regulates down in the purple area. They're the most active of our offshore regions. They have 4 producing fields currently and a very active exploration sector. The Canada Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board regulates in the green area, and they have 2 producing fields and as well an active exploration sector. The National Energy Board, we take up everything that's not those 2, and that's the yellow area that you see in the Canadian Arctic and on the West Coast. Currently, we have no offshore production in this area, but we do have companies interested in exploring and possibly creating production from previous discoveries. That's what leads me to be talking to you here today. Well, we have 3 boards. We share the same laws and regulations and cooperate deeply on all operational matters. All 3 boards regulate safety and environmental protection throughout the entire life cycle, so from geophysical through exploration, production activities, and ultimately to abandonment of production facilities. The regulatory framework that exists in Canada's offshore has been shaped both by our own experience in Canada and by international experience. In 1982, the Ocean Ranger incident spurred on the development of the basic framework that we have now. Since that time, the boards have looked for the best regulatory practices that have served other leading regulators throughout the world to develop a robust modern regulatory framework. It focuses on goals and objectives rather than prescribing means. It requires effective management systems and includes the necessity that include the necessary organizational structures, resources, accountabilities, policies, and procedures to manage and reduce operational risk. So through the 1970s and 1980s, we had active exploration going on in the Canadian Arctic offshore. Companies drilled 93 wells in the Canadian Beaufort and another 40 wells in offshore areas near the Arctic Islands. The last of these wells was drilled in 1990, and since then, only 1 well has been drilled, and that through land-fast ice. So it was more like an onshore well than an offshore well. In the early 2000s, companies began to express interest in the Canadian Arctic offshore again, and a number of licenses were issued. In early 2010, the NEB was conducting a review of the requirement for a same-season relief well. And then on the 20th of April of that year, the Macondo well blowout occurred. In response to the incident, the NEB initiated a wholesale review of safety and environmental requirements for drilling in Canadian's Arctic offshore. Through the Arctic Offshore Review, or the Arctic Review, went for almost exactly 2 years. The board examined the best information available about the hazards, risks, and safety measures associated with offshore drilling in the Canadian Arctic. The objective was to gather information and knowledge through meaningful engagement and dialogue, and we met with local communities, companies, interested third parties such as NGOs, and academics to gather perspectives. After examination, we came up with 4 key findings. First, and this is something that I've heard echoed a couple of times this morning, that it's important to recognize the community perspective. Throughout the Arctic Review, people of the North told us that they understood the importance of energy development and were not opposed to it, but they were not necessarily anywhere or at any cost. They also said that if companies are going to drill in the Arctic offshore, it must be done right. Second, when we looked at the root causes of a number of incidents, many industrial incidents, we found a common thread, and that was the absence of or the neglect of processes and procedures to identify, mitigate, and eliminate potential risks. Beneath that deficiency lies an even deeper pattern of organizational cultures that did not put safety first. The requirement for operators to have management systems ensures that the processes and procedures are available within the company. However, it cannot necessarily help if the company ignores the systems that have been put in place. The next step we recognized was to have companies move towards a positive safety culture, a culture characterized by communications founded on mutual trust, shared perceptions of the importance of safety, and by confidence in the effectiveness of preventative measures. And I'll speak a little bit more on this idea of safety culture later. The third finding of the Arctic Review was that we reaffirmed our same-season relief well policy. For a long time in Canada, we've had a policy that required a driller in the Arctic to have and demonstrate the capability to drill a relief well in the same drilling season. We reaffirmed this policy and told all the potential operators in the Canadian Arctic that they would either have to demonstrate this capability or prove to us that they had some other technological solution that could come to the same result. A lot of companies expressed concern about the policy, specifically that drilling a well in the Arctic will take longer than a single season, and that it meant to them that they would essentially have to drill 2 wells at the same time. Companies, as we've been talking to them, have indicated that they will be bringing forward proposals that will not include plans for a relief well, that they have some other idea to put forward. And so our openness to these alternatives is going to be tested before too long. The fourth and final outcome was that the board concluded that our own regulatory regime, at least the tools and methods that we have available to us, were sufficient to be able to protect the safety of northern residents, workers in the Arctic environment. So at least we had the basic framework to be able to move ahead and hear an application and scrutinize the activities that went on. The Arctic Review process also resulted in the development of a set of filing requirements for offshore drilling in the Canadian Arctic. And between the findings and the filing requirements, we had our priority work items for the review of our potential activity in the Canadian Arctic offshore, excuse me. So what may happen in the Arctic offshore? These got messed up. I'll talk about this one first. Imperial Oil Resource Ventures Limited, in a joint venture with ExxonMobil and BP, have indicated us an interest in drilling 1 or more exploratory wells in the Beaufort Sea, about 125 kilometers north-northwest of Opptak, which you can see just on the coast. The water depths in this area range between 60 and 1,500 meters, and the company has made a submission to a regional environmental assessment organization called the Inuvialuit Environmental Impact Screening Committee in September of this year. So they have started to move ahead in the process of seeking an approval for these wells. The regulatory review from the National Energy Board is expected to begin in 2014, and will certainly focus the attention of us and probably the rest of the Canadian society on the questions surrounding offshore development in Canada's Arctic. Also, just south of this development, ConocoPhillips Canada has indicated that it's in the initial planning phases of development of the Opptak field. The Opptak field was discovered in 1984 and is the largest oil and gas field yet discovered in Canada's Arctic. And it's been essentially sitting there waiting for a ripe time to develop, and ConocoPhillips may think that now is the time. So now I'm going to back up. Helge Lund actually stole my thunder on this by talking about Statoil's finds on the offshore Newfoundland. And I raise these today because the conditions that are faced here, the remoteness, the weather conditions, the ice conditions, and the deep water are similar to those conditions that are going to be faced by others in other Arctic areas. So this is something that we look to, although it's not technically in the Arctic, we're looking to the Newfoundland Board's experiences here to help inform our experience coming up in the next few years. In terms of the challenges we face in Canada, Arctic operations face a lot of the same challenges wherever you go: cold, dark, remote operations. I want to talk about 3 factors that we're facing in Canada that might be slightly different than what other jurisdictions see. The first one of these is renewed expectations, and when I say that, I mean renewed expectations of Canadians, of the industry, of regulators and governments around oil and gas development. In a way, all jurisdictions face this. The whole world was witness to what happened in Macondo, and citizens became aware of the potential dangers that come with oil and gas development in the offshore. In Canada, the public's been further sensitized to the petroleum industry by a number of incidents and activities that are going on. In July 2010, there was a pipeline spill in Michigan, and that may not be Canadian, you say, but it was a Canadian pipeline carrying Canadian crude, spilled about 20,000 barrels into the Kalamazoo River. And if that wasn't bad enough, when the results of the investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States came out, it revealed that the company, essentially the company staff ignored the alarms that went off when the pipeline began to leak, presuming that they had a bubble somewhere as they tried to restart the pipeline, and ran the pipeline for approximately 20 hours, pushing oil into the river, heedless of their own system. It wasn't until a utility worker in Michigan actually phoned the company's emergency response line to tell them that there was a leak that they actually stopped it. This played up very greatly in the Canadian press and started a rethinking of whether or not we thought our own pipelines, which actually the National Energy Board regulates, are doing a sufficient job at respecting their own management systems and their own rules. The second incident that I'll talk about was that in July this year, a number of rail cars derailed and exploded in a small town called Lac-Mégantic in Quebec. 47 people were killed that night. None of them actually worked for the company. And this hit Canadians very, very hard, as it would hit anyone. Turns out the rail cars were filled with crude. It wasn't Canadian crude that time, but it was crude being transported through Canada. The results of the investigation from the Canadian Transportation Safety Board aren't out, but so far the board has already issued an unprecedented 3 safety advisory letters to the rail regulator suggesting changes to their regulations. And it, in a way, is reinforcing Canadians' belief that oil and gas development, transportation, and use can't be done safely. The third area that I'll talk a little bit about, although not specifically, is over the past half a decade, Canadians have been faced with the idea of expanding the oil sands in northern Alberta. Oil companies are eager to exploit this very large resource, and there's been some highly publicized opposition to it by environmental, non-governmental organizations and others. Also, there's been a number of transportation infrastructure initiatives that have been going through regulatory proceedings, and those have been participated in heavily by the same ENGO groups. And this has raised the profile of oil and gas in Canada greatly. So these events have all sensitized Canadians to the issues of oil and gas development. The sensitivity will indeed carry over to any review of Arctic offshore activities and will be carefully scrutinized. Those activities will be carefully scrutinized by Canadians. Canadians are looking for increased transparency and accountability from both regulators and companies about the safety of energy industry activities. The second challenge that we face in Canada, and it may not be unique, but it's one that I can speak specifically about, is is the unique society. Canadian Arctic First Nations, so the people who were there when the Europeans arrived, essentially, have a deep connection to the natural environment, the land and the sea. At the Arctic Review, some told us that 70% of their food actually comes from the land and the sea. But harvesting food is not just an economic activity to them, not like just going to the grocery store. Harvesting food is deeply ingrained in their culture. An accident that would hurt the ability to gather food would likewise hurt their culture. Many people express to us a fear that if the effects of oil and gas development are long-term or widespread, that a generation of children might grow up without ever having learned the traditional ways of gathering from the land and the sea. And they fear that this might lead to the collapse of their culture. This challenge is related somewhat to the first finding of the Arctic Review, which recognized the importance of the community perspective. Arctic residents and Arctic First Nations will be affected by offshore development no matter what. They're looking to the regulator as well as the company to put in place systems and controls to ensure that the effects are positive. And the third issue that I'll talk about has been also talked about this morning, and that's the extreme remote location. The closest town to both the Imperial and the Conoco activities would be Opptak, or Tuk as the locals call it. Tuk's a very picturesque little hamlet of just under 1,000 people on Canada's Beaufort coast. You can get to Tuk year-round by air, weather permitting. In the winter, you can drive there on an ice road, or in the summer, there's access to Tuk's Harbor by water. If you decide to go visit, there are 2 bed and breakfast establishments. There's about 10 rooms in each, or 10 beds in each. Chances are you share a room. But there's no restaurants in Tuk. The closest hospital is in Inuvik, 140 kilometers away. The nearest city is Yellowknife, over 1,100 kilometers away. And the nearest big city in Canada is Edmonton, which is 2,000 kilometers away. Added to this, the Canadian portion of the Beaufort is covered by pack ice in the winter. Historical data indicates that the period of manageable ice conditions in the Beaufort will be approximately 120 days, sometime between May and November. There's no other oil and gas operations going on in the relevant vicinity. It's possible that at the same time they drill in the Canadian Beaufort, someone may be drilling in the US Beaufort or in the Chukchi. But the distances there probably make response kind of irrelevant. The Canadian Arctic offshore is almost the definition of remote, or that's what I wrote until I talked to my friends from Greenland, and they have something that's even more remote. But it is unbearably remote. There's no industrial infrastructure at all. There's little shipping in the area and few trained workers nearby. Transportation links exist, but they depend heavily on season and weather. And so when a company comes to propose an activity in the Canadian Beaufort, they need to be able to bring every single thing they could ever need with them. And it needs to be there, and I think we heard from Shell the challenge of not being able to put everything there at the same time and the risks that faces. So with all that, what is the NEB doing? Well, we've got a lot of things going on. We have a number of initiatives underway in preparation for activity in the Canadian Arctic offshore. We have new draft guidelines for financial responsibility. We're working hard to engage Arctic coastal communities and get their sense of their perspective on the upcoming activity. We're doing lots of technical work and training staff, making sure that we're prepared. I could discuss all of these, but I really want to focus on one single initiative because I believe it breaks new ground, at least for North American energy regulation. I talked a little bit earlier about the idea of safety culture and how the lack of culture within an operator, or the lack of culture within an operator that puts safety before other considerations, has been a recurring theme in major industrial accidents. The board identified safety culture and the current lack of regulatory tools around it as a finding in the Arctic Review. Over the past 2 years, the board has been working with other regulators, our 2 offshore boards, the US Pipeline Safety Regulator, known as PHMSA, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the BSEE in the United States, to come up, and along with a noted academic, Mark Fleming, to come up with a coherent definition of safety culture and to somehow put this concept in such a way as it could be used to develop regulatory tools. And I'm pleased to announce that yesterday we published on our website a discussion paper that does just this. The paper is called Advancing Safety in an Oil and Gas Industry, Draft Safety Culture Framework. And the paper sets forth a definition of safety culture and a framework that the NEB will use to look at safety culture of the companies it regulates. We believe that a focus on safety culture, in addition to robust regulations and standards and effective management systems, will allow us to see the next level in safety from the facilities and activities we regulate. I'm not going to talk at length about the paper here. You can all download it from our website, but I'm going to give a bit of a teaser. According to the draft framework, a strong safety culture is one in which, for example, leaders demonstrate that safety is a overriding value and priority, that everyone is aware of the known hazards and remains vigilant to new threats. Employees feel encouraged to report safety hazards even when they have actually committed the error that resulted in the safety hazard. And I like this one the best. The supervisor does not have to be present for people to do something right. The framework also identifies 4 cultural factors that can be defined and evaluated within a company. This, we hope, will lead to tools that regulators or even a company could use to examine where the operator is on a positive safety culture continuum and what can be done to make positive changes to improve safety outcomes. So as I mentioned, this framework is currently published on our website and can be downloaded from there, and we would be interested in any comments any of you have on it. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the organizers again, the PSA. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk and present some perspectives from the National Energy Board about Arctic offshore energy. Thank you for your attention, and I'm prepared to take questions.
Thank you very much. You clearly demonstrate why it's important for the regulators to cooperate and why the companies can learn so much from other Arctic activities. Just a brief question there from me. Yesterday on Road 2, here we have authorities from regulators in Russia, Canada and Greenland, and also the Icelandic authorities were present yesterday, but they had to leave. How did you find the meeting? Was it useful for you can you reveal something?
I'm not sure how much I can reveal, but yes, it was very interesting in just talking together about how we approach the industry, how we approach talking to the industry, and where best practices could probably allow us all to approach the industry better and maybe in a little bit more alignment. We all take our own take on how to have a conversation with companies, industry as a whole. But I think as regulators talk together, we can learn from each other and get best practices.
So it won't be the last meeting?
No, I don't
No.
think so, no.
There are plans. I think Anne will come back to that later. For now, I can tell you that I do have this fish book also in English. So you can go back to Canada and cook some Norwegian recipes. Just a moment. So give a big hand to Jim Fox and thank you.
Thank you.